Hey guys, this is the third part of the lecture series for week 3 of IT 485 and 386. This is going to be a quicker video. I just wanted to run you through the real quick, just like the programs and workflows that you're going to be doing this semester so you can get like an overall view of what you're going to be doing. So you get a real broad picture of basically everything that's involved for modeling and texturing for video games. Just so it should help with any loss or confusion that's going on. And it should help guide you throughout this semester so it kind of gives you a roadmap of what you're doing. So start off with, usually there's some type of creation of concept artwork or reference image gathering so that you have some type of ideas of what you're modeling, what its dimensions are, what its kind of shapes and sizes, and just to give you a good blueprint of what you're doing. And besides modeling, also what type of textures you're going to be applying to it and how it should look in game. So this is the blast door. Basically, it started with that concept artwork from Wasteland saying, hey, build your own type of blast door. Here's some first type of concept artwork, but can you start and develop your own concept artwork for an original piece? So this is just a drawing I did of the blast door that I was trying to envision. So basically the door had the big elements that I was concerned with is that the door was split diagonally, so I could either move left and right or they can go up and down. A big element is I wanted to get some type of looking glass, so that someone can see what's going on the other side, because that seemed to be a prevalent part of the blast door concept. And then also to get that feeling of like reinforced metal, ribbed metal. So I kind of, and very jagged edges usually, lends itself to like very militaristic or, they're not making stuff that looks pretty. They want stuff that is solid. So I kind of went for like these really jagged edges, and these are kind of like the reinforced ribs, and these are different sections of the door. And so this is one half of the door and this is the other. And that's my basic idea. And then I scanned it in, brought it into Photoshop, and started playing around. I found images online through CG Textures, and also just doing Google searches and any other search engine you can think of, our art sites. You just do searches and you can find stuff. So for example, I wanted there to be a hallway, like you're looking down like a military type installation hallway. And then, this would be like the reinforced glass that's in this part of the door, and it's transparent so you can see the hallway through it. Those are big elements that I want to express in my concept artwork, because these are big ideas that I'm trying to revolve around with my artwork. And then here's like a section of the door that I started to paste in, and I did a color adjustment on it because certain parts of the door are going to be different colors. That's just the way I did this. I wanted to do it. What was also important is finding metal pictures that kind of had these kind of rivets, this reinforced metal. This happens to be like aircraft metal, but it just looks like it's like heavy duty manufacturing on it. And then these pieces are like the outer rebar areas of the door, and then like I would build out this inner part that goes around, and then these sections too in a very similar fashion, and then build out my concept artwork. So I kind of know what my concept artwork is doing. Two main things, like shows me the components of the door that I need to model, then shows me the type of textures I want to apply, and the overall look and theme and color palette and everything that comes together makes it like a really cool asset. You just have to do some planning to make everything come together and just make it look like it flows smoothly. And then what I would do from this is, once I have my concept artwork and I understand what I'm doing, I might format this image a bit, make sure that it's appropriately scaled, appropriately and sized, so that I can bring it into Maya and start modeling on top of it. So those videos will be next week that Chris is creating. And also, to note that this is like the front view of the door. It's also very important to do concept artwork to understand how this thing would function. Like I'm very big with, I wanted this like diagonal pieces. And so, you know, you have to understand how you're modeling to prepare for animation. Because if you have to think a few steps ahead, because you got like modeling, texturing, rigging, animating, and then this asset is fully workable in the game engine. You know, so you get used to all these areas of production, and then when you're really comfortable, you can start thinking ahead, and that's the reason for doing this planning, so that it's a really easy process to go from start to finish to have a functioning asset in game. So anyway, this was the front view of the door, right? And then I might change. I might do like a side view and a top-down view. This happens to we start with doors because they're so flat usually, so it's a good introduction piece to work on, both with concept art in Photoshop and modeling in Maya. But as I showed you in the other video where like concept artwork of characters, you had the front, the side, and then there's this whole workflow in Photoshop to make sure your front, side, top is all exactly proportional to each other, so that when you pop them all into Maya, that everything lines up. Because if like the top is like bigger than the side and front, when you're modeling, your model isn't going to line up in all these views. So there's that whole like workflow to creating these model reference images that are exactly proportional to the way they should be. Once you create your concept and your model references, and this is also like the beginnings of my textures, you would jump from Photoshop into Maya, and then here is this 3D object that was created from the reference artwork. So here you can actually see what the door looks like. This model is exactly 2.5 meters wide, 2.5 meters high, and 0.125 meters thick at its thickest point, because you see it's like thin here and thick up here. And so this model was exactly built to the specifications that I was given. This one actually had very specific dimensions. That's not always the case. But again, here's the glass viewport. And you can see, if I go back to Photoshop, you can see how I kind of fleshed out these parts of the door. And here's how it kind of came together in a 3D model. So this is Maya. It's a 3D package. You're going to do these modeling. This type of geometry is known as polygons. Surfaces, there's nothing inside of it. If I take one of these parts and I delete it, you can actually see inside the model a bit. So I'm actually looking inside. So let me undo that. So actually you're just like building this surface that represents a 3D object. And then you'll apply materials onto it. That's why this glass part of the door, is actually transparent. You can actually see through it, and you actually get these like bevels. If you notice these areas that are cut differently than the rest, as I move around, you see how the light is kind of catching on them. That's known as specular highlights, and we'll get into that later in class. But you see how it really kind of brings the object to light, and when I look directly at it, you see it kind of turns white, the glass. So that's getting into like these textures get fed into these materials here. So you see how I can lower this transparency, and now it's solid again. I can raise it back up. That's clear. I can add like a slight color. Usually glass is like a little bit of blue in it. The background happens to be a bluish color, so you might not really see it. But anyway, these is these materials that add, like you can make rubbers and wood and metal and anything you can think of with these materials. That these materials also exist in the game engine too. So basically you're just using materials in Maya to test out your textures that will eventually go into the Unity game engine. So first, you use modeling workflows to create whatever objects you want to create. And we'll get into all this. I'm just quickly just modeling out some random object real quickly and just showing you that these are kind of the workflows that you'll be getting involved with. So you see really quickly, you could just start making an object. And everything is this default gray. It's just this like basic material that's applied onto everything. And that's where you get into texturing and materials. So materials make an object appear like it's made of some type of material, like a metal or wood or what have you. And you use these base textures, which if I go over to Photoshop, I made this like texture that's supposed to look like a type of metal, and then here it's like painted metal, and here's the glass. You can almost see how the door, that's why we start with the door. It's so flat that you can easily understand the 2D representation of this 3D object, because there's this process that goes through with texturing called UVing that can be rather complicated. So you can see how this is my texture. It's a flat 2D texture, and I can apply it to my object, which it already is applied. You just don't see it right now. I just have to click in the shaded view, textured view, and now you see my door has this type of texture on it. So you see we got this kind of metal material going. We got this glass material. He's starting to look like the door that was in my concept artwork. So you see that this door, when you make a 3D model, you have to go through this process of applying a two-dimensional image, the texture, and wrapping it on a three-dimensional object. So this process is called UVing. And basically what it says is it's a way to specify how this 3D object gets unwrapped into a two-dimensional plane, 2D. So think of like origami, how you can take like a flat piece of paper and fold it up and make a 3D object. Or think of like gift wrapping paper, how a sheet of wrapping paper will wrap around a box or some type of gift, and it becomes like the skin of the box. So you have to take this 2D flat image and wrap it onto this 3D object. Now this happens to be a flat door, so you know it's a very almost 2D. Which again, exactly why we start with it. But you can see how it's there's some surfaces on the object that are not flat, that are coming off at different angles. And we have to unwrap or basically lay out this object in a 2D world. So here you can kind of see the beginnings of it. And again, we'll get into this more later on in class, but this is just to introduce you to these topics. So first you create the model, and then you unwrap it, meaning lay out these UVs, lay out this 3D object. A 3D object is contained of vertices, basically points in 3D, X, Y, and Z. So X is left and right, Z is forward, backward, Y is up and down. You can see it in the compass here. All you have to know, you have to understand 3 points to know where this point lies in 3D space. And so each of these points I'm clicking on and moving is called a vertice. It's just a point that helps to define this surface, this 3D object, which is empty on the inside. It's just a surface. And it's these vertices that get laid out in a 2D plane like this that get stretched out flat. There's no third dimension. And then with that, we can kind of bring this information into Photoshop. And then from Photoshop, we can say, oh, this is, we can paint a texture on it that's in line with the flat 2Ds. So this texture, when it gets applied to this object, gets wrapped onto it like gift wrapping paper onto a 3D object. So it's like the skin of the object. So it's like this object has no interior, it's just a surface. And then that surface needs color information, it needs shading information. So it's not just this gray material. And how to get that surface, that color information onto it is with this 2D texture, this 2D image. And how do you get a 2D image onto a 3D surface is you need this type of UV information, which says how to lay out this 2D image onto a 3D object. Then, right now, this is just the color information, like the diffuse, the red, greens, and blues that make up the color information. There's other stuff going on here too. That's what these materials are for. Like you have basic color, which is a 2D texture image. And then you can get into like specularity. So if I change this, you should start to see that there's a specular highlight on this object. And if not, then I have to introduce another topic, is that this is a flat texture right now. And then if you want to see more, there's this high quality mode. It's just another viewing mode. Again, we'll get more into this later, but all you really have to know is that now I can play with this specular highlight on it. So specularity is like how light reflects off an object. So a really shiny object like a brushed metal, or like a piece of wooden furniture that has a really bright shine on it, is going to reflect light brightly. You see that? Like here's a very high reflectivity, and then you can kind of tighten it up or lower it down. Where objects would have very little specular highlight, like a matte surface, a rubber ball, a tennis ball, a piece of paper, non-glossy paper. Your clothing is basically has no specularity. It's just no reflected light on it. So that's when these materials start coming in handy, because you can create more advanced effects. So now this is definitely, as I move this around, you see how bright the specular highlight is. That's when you're running around in game, and based on your viewing angle of an object, maybe the specular highlight changes so you really feel like this object is real. The other thing going on here is a bump mapping on it, also known as normal map, but we'll get into that later. Basically, all you really have to understand is that bump mapping is used a lot in games. It helps create more surface detail than is not really there. So you see, as this specular light goes across the door, you see how like jaggy the door is. It doesn't look flat, and you can really see it in the specular highlight that there's a lot of surface detail on this object. So if I kill the bump mapping, now you see how flat the door is. I still have all my color information, and I still have this specular highlight, but I don't have all that jagginess that's in it. So I can bring that back and connect the normal map, which is a texture file, a 2D texture image, very similar to the diffuse, our color map, but it's like a normal map. It's saying how to push the normals out. It's this kind of purplish map. I will get into that, what it's doing. It's a little bit more complicated. But you see, as I bring it back in, now as I move around, you see how the lighting hits the surface, because there's a lot more surface details. Basically like adding all this detail onto the surface, where it's really just a flat plane. I break it, you see it's just a flat plane, but I added all that surface detail. So that's what you do in the 3D package, basically modeling stuff. You're unwrapping the UVs so that you can create a texture in Photoshop and plug this texture into some type of material and test out the material and be like, oh, this really looks like metal, this really looks like polished wood, or what have you. And then you kind of do your material testing in Maya to make sure that the object, the model looks good, the UVs are correct so that the texture is clean and being applied to the 3D model correctly. And then you're kind of testing out, trying to figure out what type of specular highlights you should have and what type of normal map you should use to get that, to really make it look like whatever material it is you're trying to achieve. Then you'll export this model out of this 3D package, which happens to be Maya, and then you'll take your texture files that you created in Photoshop, your diffuse, which is your color information, maybe even a specular highlight map and a normal map, which we'll talk about later, and then you'll bring it into the game engine. So this is Unity, and in fact, this is the file that Wasteland gives you to test your assets out in. So what they give you is a scene with some lights already in it and a silhouette of a person that's to scale, and then there's this box here that you can apply your material, you can test your material on it. But basically what you do is you bring your model in. Maybe I should do this from scratch, but you bring your model into the scene. I can just delete it. I bring the model in. You'd import it into the package, just like a file. You can like open up a file, you'd bring it in, right? I bring my door into the scene, I can position it, and then you'll notice that it's that gray because there's no material assigned to it. And then you kind of build your materials. So this is just a material, I just clicked on it, and there's all these different materials. We'll talk about a few of them. But basically, you're going to use materials where you can plug in your diffuse map. This should look familiar. I showed you this in Photoshop. And this is the normal map. I showed you it briefly. I just didn't want to get into normal maps to make things, to try not make things too complicated. But basically, this is a material where the textures plug into it. So basically, this is telling the diffuse information. This is telling the normal information. And now I have a material that I can apply onto my object. And you see, I could apply it to other things. Like I could apply it to the floor, and actually that's how I got this material onto this box here, is I just dragged it onto it. So materials can be applied to many things, but you know, the materials are made for certain objects. So the textures plug into them. These materials are made for certain objects, and then the materials you make from those textures really work with whatever the objects are that were meant to be built with it. So this material is really meant to be made with this door. So I have my color information, my normals, which shows this like detail, this like ruffled up detail that wouldn't be there if I didn't have that normal information. It would just be a flat plane. And then the way they have this shininess scale, so you can actually adjust how big the specular highlight is. So not only do you see it in the door here, but you see it down here in the preview. Watch this. This is like a preview, just like a sphere to show you how your textures look, and you can see how that specular highlight is being affected. So this is like a really shiny metal. In realistic, if it's like a military grade metal, you know, it's been buffed out. It's not going to be too shiny, but you know, I went with all these colors and these exotic patterns, so maybe it does have a little bit of shine to it because it seems to be a little bit, you know, exaggerated. So you see, as I move around in the game world, I'm getting a very similar effect that I did in Maya. You can see my color information, and as I move my camera around, you can see the specular highlight moving around, which is coming from the lights that are in the scene. We'll get more on that later. And you can see how the specular highlight is dancing across the surface of the object. And that normal map is getting used there too, because it's breaking up the surface. These aren't just flat planes. It looks like a metal, galvanized metal material. So you see how all that work I did from the concept artwork to understand what I was going to make went into Maya, where I actually built the object and unwrapped its UVs so that I could work on its textures in Photoshop, then reapply the textures back in Maya into a material so I can make sure that everything looks cool and I don't have to go back to Photoshop and keep reworking the texture, or if I realize there's issues with my model, I got to go back and rework my model. Then when I'm happy with everything, I can go into Unity and actually test it in the game engine, and I have to rebuild my material basically. Using materials that are available in Unity, which are materials are going to be a little different. Every engine, every game engine, every 3D package has similar materials, but they're a little different. These materials are made exclusively to be used in a game engine, meaning real-time rendering, whereas the Maya materials are more for, you can take images and they're used a little bit differently. So anyway, my window looks good. I could see the guy through it and everything. Now, let me click play. Actually, I got to move the blast door into the turntable. Long story short, this is so it gets parented and receives the animation of the turntable, so that when I click play, the door revolves around on this turntable along with everything else, and you can see the door in relation to the man, the door in relation to this kind of cargo box, and how it looks from this viewpoint. And this is the camera view in game. So you see like a big door, 2.5 meters is almost like 7.5, 8 feet. Like 1 meter is like around 3 feet. So you can see that this door, which is about 7.5 by 7.5 feet, this is what it looks like in the game view from this 3/4 almost top-down camera view. So you can see like this is what a 6-foot person would look like in the screen real estate size that he's going to be, and this is what maybe like a 3 foot wide or 2.5 foot wide cube or box will look like, and this is what a 7.5 foot by 7.5 foot door will look like in the game world. That's why you have to understand why I was saying you have to exaggerate the details. Don't really worry about smaller details. At this view, you know, you just get the hint that it's metal. You know, like as this is turning, it's getting hit by that light blue spotlight and then that like orange spotlight. And as the light changes, you can kind of see how the specular highlight's changing on the door, and you get the idea that it's a metal door. You know, we can improve this obviously to make it look more metalish in how it's being interacted with the lights, but in general you can get the brief idea that it's metal, you know. And I made the viewing glass like really big, and all the big components of the door, like the black part up here, the red and the blues, they're all relatively large so that you can see them from this distance. So keep that in mind, that this game is almost like a top-down, a 3/4 view, and objects are pretty small. So that's why you work on larger objects, tables, little shanty houses, a big blast door. You know, if you do rocks, you know, make even the smallest version pretty sizable. You know, they will be duplicating a lot of small and medium and large rocks, and so you have to do different sizes. And the same with if you want to get involved with smaller assets, like someone wanted to make a big machine gun that sits on the ground. Now that you see this viewpoint, you can understand that you really just need to get some details on the top of the gun. The sides and the bottom of the gun can be really simple textures, really simple geometry, because it's going to be seen from afar. So you just need that hint, the big details to understand that it's a gun. Or like someone was going to make that little brick garage with like an oil barrel drum and like a little paint can. So the brick garage, no problem. The oil barrel, not even that a problem. You'll be able to, it'll be like half the size of this cube. You'd still understand that that was an oil barrel. And you see that it's pretty small, so you don't need to do like crazy details. And a paint can is going to even be smaller. You don't even need to make like a full can, a full cylinder. You could probably do like cut out half a cylinder and just lay it on the ground, and you'll still think it's a cylinder from this viewpoint. So that's why you do concept artwork, to really understand what your requirements are You don't want to go too crazy on smaller items like a paint can and rocks and such when you're going to see them from this distance. And that's why you do your testing, really understand how this asset's going to be used as an end product. And then you can decide your concept artwork, move forward from there. So you don't have to spend all this time modeling this crazy enhanced, high-res model in these super high-res textures when you're going to see something from this distance. And that's why if you review the Wasteland 2, there's like that art guide I was showing you in the other video where it had like the train and stuff. And they were talking about use exaggerated details, only focus on like the larger details because you're only going to see the larger details from this point of view and that the camera is this far off the ground. All right, so I hope that was informative. And again, if you have any questions, any confusions, or any suggestions, or you want to continue this conversation of how we're going to work in class and what assets we're going to work and you're really interested in trying to figure out what you're creating or how you should go about it, and you just need help in the creative process and brainstorming, whatever, just post in the forums, the WIP forums, or the general news. Just post up and just ask help and questions, and you'll be surprised how nice people are. And now's the time. If you still have questions or confusion on what you should be working on every week, what the goal of the class is, talk now. Talk in the forums and just get it out. And let's make sure we clear up anything so we can all move forward, every week. And remember, post in the forums, even if you feel like your work is not finished. Explain that. There's been a lot of people who are like, I think my shadows aren't looking good or whatever, but, this is where I'm at right now, and I'll post another one a little later. Would really appreciate some feedback. You have to get used to exposing your work, exposing yourself to people, getting feedback and enhancing it. It's the only way you're going to grow. So please post in the forums and let me know if you have any other questions. The rest of the videos, I'll make another video about like in-depth Photoshop stuff, and then I'll make another video on like turning the concept artwork into a modeling reference, and then post up canned mushroom videos. And then so your assignment for the week is to turn your art concept into like modeling references and really define out your textures and your models, and we're going to jump into modeling next week.